All right, so we're going to talk about working memory and cognitive load and lifeguarding basically. So basically, when we're lifeguarding, when we need to recognize people that are in distress, when they're in trouble, see a dangerous behaviors, that something doesn't appear right in our scan, that we need to go check on it, to actually recognize that and actually understand what we're looking at is a high cognitive load. So lifeguarding has a high responsibility context to it. It's you have to recognize people that are in trouble, and the idea is to get them preventively if we stop them from getting into trouble. But when they do get into trouble, how we're going to help them. But we need to be able to recognize that's going to happen. And that whole process of being able to do that has high cognitive load. So basically, when we're looking at it, we got about 4 gears going on in our brain while we're doing things. As long as the information's coming in, and it's kind of like our whole body, our whole world comes into our head, into our mind, and we start picking and choosing what tasks we're going to do. If we need to do some math to figure out how much that bill is going to cost us at the grocery store, or when we're, again, like I said, when we're lifeguarding, we're looking out and looking at people, we've got to figure out how to scan, what zones are we scanning, how do I know I'm in the right area, and then you also have to have the recognition. You have to have the ability in the back of your head, in your mind, in long-term memory on what does a drowning victim look like, what does a patron look like who's in distress, what is a bad behavior to be doing or a dangerous behavior to be doing in a swimming pool. But what happens when we get this, something else gets into those 4 cogs that we got working for us in our working memory, and then it sets everything off, and then now all of a sudden when we're lifeguarding, we are not really seeing what we need to see, or the scanning isn't going to be appropriate because we could be easily distracted by something. So basically, working memory is kind of like what some people describe it as, and it's come through neurosciences. And it's not your short-term memory, it's not your long-term memory, what they refer to. It's just the memory that is used to get tasks done through the day. It's how we get through the day. Uh, I love the explanation of it. It's basically sticky notes. So when we have a task in front of us that we have to do, if we have to do math, our long-term memory goes finds the formula, brings it in, we do the math, divide it, and then it's done. Long-term working memory is really good at only keeping the information in your forefront of your memory, or what the material, the idea that you need to do something, and it gets rid of all the extra noise that you don't need to be dealing with. So if you think about like this picture, you have all this information coming at you all the time. You have all this external sensory input. You have long-term memory that where you can draw from, and you have all this stuff coming in. And what your working memory basically does is sort out all the information. Well, the thing about working memory is that it's very short. It can really only hold 3 to 4 things. You've probably heard the thing that we can track between 6 one or two, like -1 or 2, so you can track up to 8. Maybe you can only track to 4. So a lot of the neuroscientists and the work gone into working memory and that kind of thing is, well, how many pieces of information you track at one time is about 4. And an example here is like you got this cauldron where you can like information come through, so you can hold about really 4 pieces of information really well in your working memory to get it done. So the question is probably what you're wondering is then, how do we actually get to do these complex tasks when we can only hold 4? So we're going to get to that. Cognitive load is the amount of information that's coming into you that your brain has to work through and sort through. And one of the big things that working memory is really good is sorting through what is necessarily to do that task at that point. So you could have people talking beside you, you got reports you want to do, there's education, you're watching YouTube, and you can have all this stuff, and your brain will actually sort out the material that you need and the information you need to actually do the task that at hand that you need to do. What happens with cognitive overload? Cognitive overload is basically when our brain gets overwhelmed. So if you ever get to the point where, holy cow, I got so much information coming at me, I can't process it, I don't know what to do with it, and you become actually overwhelmed, and you can actually get paralyzed, like, right? You don't know what the next step is. So when we talk about this, like in lifeguarding and as in being a paramedic and paramedicine, that when you're on calls and when you're getting to that overwhelmed state, you actually bring back into your training where you have that systematic approach where you work your way through things, right? Like your ABCs, you want to make sure the scene's safe, you want to know, you work through your scanning techniques, and you figure it out. So when we're talking about lifeguarding, if you think about this, these are like 4 sticky notes in our brain, right? We have our memory up here, that our long-term memory, where we've put all the ideas of where presentations of drowning victims and distressed swimmers are. We got all our swimmers up over here that we need to go through and figure out if they need help because they're in our pool. So one of the things though is when we're new to lifeguarding, or if we're new to anything, some of these tasks seem quite daunting. When initially, when we first start, those tasks, as we get the experience, I should say, and the more we get better at it, and we get this automaticity, kind of muscle memory, they don't seem as hard to do. So initially, when we first start out, we got our 4 sticky notes, right? But the problem is when we first start, from our working memory, we need to bring in our scanning ability into one of those spots, scan the pool. We need to bring in what does a drowning or basically a patron in trouble look like. We got to bring them into different spots. And then one at a time, like all we can do is bring in one person at a time. And then it will take us actually longer to recognize somebody in trouble because when we first start, we have this cognitive load we have to manage and bring in and out, and so we can recognize people or even like dangerous behaviors. So as we become more experienced, the more practice we do, things change. So actually, I was going to jump back here for a second, and, and as you're looking at all these people up here, we actually have a kid in here that's actually wide-eyed and calling for help that recognizes like one of our things down here, which you probably didn't recognize because there is a lot going on the screen. So next we're going to talk about cognitive overload. How does that work? Like, what is cognitive overload? So if because we're all lifeguarding, we all learn to swim. When we jump in the pool and do front crawl or do any type of stroke, it's a complicated task. One arm's got to move this way, this arm moves this way, I got to breathe, I got to kick, it's got to be forward propulsion, I got to grab the water with my hands so I can feel the pressure. And if you think about it, if you look way back when you first learned to swim, that was really hard to do, to get your head wrapped around something. Now the thing is, if you're working on your strokes and somebody comes in and wants to change your stroke to make it faster, more efficient, trying to make that change in that stroke to catch the water better, you cognitively have to think about it. But when we teach swimming, we don't just push the person in the water and say, I want you to float, move this arm this way, move this arm this way, move this arm this way. We have a progression. So what we do is we build through a progression. If we actually threw everybody in the water and expected them to swim and gave them 20 different instructions, they get cognitive overload, they would become overwhelmed, and then they become paralyzed where they would not be able to actually do the work. But because it is a cognitive task and it's high load, how are we able to do it is the question. What happens is we build automaticity, we become practice. We talk about muscle memory, which really isn't even muscle memory. It's just the idea that we just became accustomed through practice to be able to do this without having to think about it, or having to, like we're talking about one of those sticky notes, without having to take up one of those spaces on those sticky notes. So how do we complete complex tasks? We do it through practice, we do it through automaticity, which means building that muscle memory, and we also have other skill sets that we start adding into it. So one of those is like having a flow chart we practice. We have decision trees. And after we do all that, practicing that, it becomes a thing they call schema, or it becomes a chunk of information. We call it chunking. We break it down. And that schema and that chunk of information allows us to easily run through that type of information quickly and get the right information that we need to complete that task, which is ours is lifeguarding and recognizing somebody's in trouble. Again, I just went through some of these. So we talk about scripting. So scripting is basically that, if this happens, I do this, right? So with a flow chart, or like the flow chart is also a decision tree. That's your policies and procedures. What procedure do you do if you have a cardiac arrest in your pool? It will have all the steps. And by having all the steps laid out, and when you practice them over and over, you actually don't have to put them in each of one of those sticky notes. Next one is practicing, again, like halo events. And halo was basically high acuity, low outcome. So you, again, practice stuff that you don't normally going to have. And the high acuity is that means somebody serious is going to be seriously in trouble. And that would be like a cardiac arrest in your pool. It doesn't happen very often. It may never even happen. But it's something that you have to practice. You have to practice recognizing your fellow lifeguards pretending they're drowning and go in and get them and pull them out, because it's a high acuity event, because you're risking yourself, you're risking the patrons that you're coming to your facility, because you got to know how to do it, but you need to practice that. The other thing too is biggest distractions. We've been talking about distractions. You need to remove the distractions. while you're lifeguarding, right? So that way we don't have other stuff peeking into the front of our brain and let us do it. And then the biggest one is don't start combining complex tasks. So complex tasks, right, are like the bit like the scanning. We do recognition. We don't want to be, doing math while we're scanning, right? We don't want to be studying our homework on the edge of a deck, especially if you're working in a small outdoor pool and you don't have a lot of people in the pool. Like you might only have one or two show up that day, but studying your homework while watching two people in the pool probably isn't the best thing. That's where mistakes happen.